Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wade Gurley, and I will be talking about the Florida bonneted bat current research and monitoring efforts going on throughout the state. So before I get started, I just want to thank quite a few people. The people in red are the people that have mostly helped put together information that I've drawn from this presentation today. Jennifer Myers, Kathleen Smith, and Jeff Gore. They were also on some of the first people that started working with bonneted bats in the state. And then a lot of the research is a joint effort between FWC and University of Florida. So some of the funding for that came from Florida Non-Game Wildlife Trust Fund, Bat Conservation International, and various other sources. Also would like to thank the staff at Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area and all the collaborators and field assistants that are listed here just for the help with the capture events. So just to get started, for those of you who are not familiar with bonneted bats, talking about the taxonomy of the species, they are members of the family Molossidea, which is the free-tailed bats. Free-tailed just refers to the presence of a long bony tail that extends beyond the tail membrane. You can see it in the picture, in this picture here with the tail extension. They also, members of the species have relatively long and narrow wings. In fact, members of the genus Eumops, which the bonneted bat is a member of, have some of the longest and narrowest wings in this family, and that's really good for long distance flight. Until recently, this bat was identified as a subspecies of the Florida mastiff bat, and as recently as 2004, it was reclassified as an individual and separate species based on morphological data and some data from the fossil data. So just talking about the appearance of the bonneted bat, you have a range of measurements here that have been taken. The Florida bonneted bat is the largest bat species that's found in Florida. The only other molossid member that is found in Florida is the Brazilian free-tailed bat, and you can see here in the picture a comparison of the size difference. Also, the coloration of the bonneted bat, it's light or dark brown, can vary from that to gray. And most of these bats possess a characteristic white marking across the abdomen. You can see here a picture of, on the right-hand side of a bat. These white markings actually can be used to identify individuals sometimes amongst colonies. But the Florida bonneted bat does have a very restricted range, one of the most restricted ranges of any bat species in North America. Currently only known from, I think the official record is 6 counties in Florida, but documentation from there is lacking at this point. So talking about the behavior of the Florida bonneted bat, they are a non-migratory species. They are active year-round except on nights of low temperatures. They do tend to emerge about 25 to 30 minutes after sunset and will return to their roost frequently throughout the night. We have noticed differences between the sexes on these and probably seasonal differences too based on females if they have young in the roost. They are high and fast flyers. They fly generally about 10 meters high over open areas, traveling long distances. And currently, dispersal distances and home range data is unknown. Some of the research that University of Florida is working on hopes to address some of the lack of that knowledge. Talking about reproduction and social structure, the reproductive strategy is poorly understood. Most bats in the temperate range generally have a breeding season that extends from about mid-April to mid-August. In fact, it's illegal to put up bat exclusions in Florida within this time period. One thing we've noticed with bonneted bats is they do have young outside of this time window, so current regulatory rules are not necessarily the best for this species. They do possibly exhibit a harem-style social structure. Based on some of the research that I'm going to be discussing here in a few minutes, we hope to clarify the social structure of the species. But basically a harem social structure is where you have many females per male living in one population. One thing that we are looking at also with bonneted bats is roost switching. So basically looking at the propensity of individuals and groups to switch roosts, whether that be based on time of year, the age of the bat, if there's environmental or seasonal differences. I have a couple of examples to show later on where you can see that there are not statistically definitive yet, but some notified differences between the sexes in roost switching. And then just talking about the conservation history of bonneted bats. Remember, up until 2004, it was listed as the Florida Mastiff bat. Previous to that, in 1992, that bat species was listed as state endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Commission here in the state. In 2009, the Florida bonneted bat, this is after it had been separated as a distinct species, it was listed as a candidate for federal endangered status, and then in 2013, it was officially recognized by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a federally endangered species. A large portion of this is because of that restricted range, and so little information is known about the species. So that were two of the main driving forces behind that listing status. And so, knowing that, I just want to talk about some of the research and monitoring projects that are ongoing through the state. I'm going to focus mainly on those last 2 points, but just talking about some of the other projects that are going on. Acoustic monitoring is, to date, probably the best means that we have to determine the presence or absence of bonneted bats in an area. That's basically you take out a bat acoustical monitoring machine, you can set it up in basically anywhere that you have access to. It records data overnight. You can take those, all the calls that are recorded on it, look at those. There is a distinct signature to bonneted bat calls. It's actually within a very low range. Humans can actually hear the echolocation calls of bonneted bats. So it's a very distinct species. You can look at all these different markers and determine if bonneted bats are present in that area. Roost monitoring, if you actually have the luck to know where bonneted bats roost overnight, you can monitor those roosts. You can do emergence counts, which you go out prior to sunset, and you just sit there a long time and count the number of bats that come out of that roost. If you have the capabilities, either a peeper pole or just to visually look inside this roost, you can count the number of young that stay behind at the end of the night after the adults leave, just to know the reproductive success of those individuals. So also probably what's I find most interesting anyway, the last two bat houses at Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, which is just down the road, they've actually instituted a pit tag monitoring program, so putting pit tags in these bats and monitoring their movement between houses, and also kind of in conjunction with capture events, radio transmitters and GPS tags that are placed on some of these bats. So focusing specifically on the bat houses at Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, since 2007, 2008, there have been 13 bat houses that have been erected specifically for the bonneted bat. 5 in 2012 and 8 prior to that, a few years before. Of those 13 houses, 2 houses were occupied within the first year by bonneted bats. So it was a pretty quick response to the building of these houses. All the bat houses are put on poles that are 5 to 7 meters high. There's a picture here of a house on the right. And each pole has 2 houses per roost, or 2 houses per pole, and this we consider one roost. So starting in 2014, prior to this, they were just going to these houses and looking up there visually during the day to see if there were any bats present. If there were, they would go back at sunset and do an emergence count to find out how many bats were in the house. And then during the time of the year that the young are born, they can go back and look up there and count the number of babies that are present in those houses. So 2014, they initiated a project where they actually put these pit tag readers on these bat houses. This is something that's not necessarily good for a natural roost because just the structure of the pit tag readers needs a stable horizontal structure, which these bat houses provide. But so these pit tags, basically it's the same that you'd put in a pet. It just lets you know each bat gets an individual tag. It lets you know that individual every time that individual leaves or enters these houses. So to actually put the pit tags in the bats at all these houses where they had known colonies of these bats living, they put up these tall nets outside around the houses, fully enclosing the houses. And then once the bats started exiting, They captured the bats in the nets, pulled them down. Once the bats were in hand, they were able to identify the sex of the individual, take measurements on it, determine if it was an adult or a juvenile, determine it or an adult or juvenile that was actually flight capable, take different measurements on these bats, and then we repeat these captures 3 times a year, April, August, and December. So it lets us kind of see the status of these individuals over the course of these different time. And then the picture on the right is just a picture of the pit tag insertion device. It's kind of just a large needle, similar to, again, what you put in a pet. So this is a map of the current bat houses that are located on Babcock. You see in blue the houses that actually have a reader present. Recently, in the last couple of months, we put one in at W9. So there's currently 6 houses that have pit tag capable reading devices on there. One thing, too, that's kind of when I show you some of the data that we've collected later on, you may notice that house 8 is the most eastern house. It's located, that complex of houses 4, 12, and 11. That's kind of the main set of houses that most of the bats are using at Babcock right now. And the distance between house 12 and house 8 is about 18 or 19 kilometers. So that's quite a distance spread. But that kind of makes it interesting when we look at some of the data later on. You might notice that house is a little more isolated. House number 8 is a little more isolated than the others. And so it may explain some of the differences that we see between the houses. So just looking at the total number of pit tagged bats. Since 2014 and the inception of the project, 202 individual bats have been tagged up to August. The actual numbers captured this year are not on there, but it was upwards of 30. So the 2016 numbers is going to be around 58 or 60 bats. But there is a slight difference in the number of bats that are tagged every year. This is because a lot of the times when you're capturing, you are capturing some of the bats that already have these pit tags in them, so there's no need to put another one. So this does represent the number of new bats every capture event. And then just looking at some of the objectives for the data that we're hoping to collect. There's any number of questions that you could answer with this data, but we're hoping basically mainly to compare colony size and composition among the roosts, fluctuation in size, relatedness of members. One thing they do collect when they have these bats in hand is DNA and genetic data, so you can find out in the end if these bats are, what level of relatedness is between members of a roost. We look at roost fidelity, whether these bats stay in one roost or their propensity to leave and move to another one, also known as roost switching. And then activity patterns between individuals over different times of the night, seasonal, environmental, if there's differences between the ages or between the sexes, and then the reproductive status, if it's a male that we think is a dominant male versus a male that's not dominant. And the same with females, whether they are lactating, pregnant, post-lactating, whatever their status is, based on the capture event update. So just a couple of examples of the data that we're getting from this. I won't get into terribly technical, but this picture here, each row represents a different bat house. And then this is the individuals that are detected per night. So it kind of represents over time from September 2015 to May 2016, the number of individuals that were recorded using that bat house per night. So just kind of a rough overview, you can kind of see the differences between population size within those houses. W11 has, and it's always been a house that's highly populated. W4 has had fewer bats using it over the course of time. You can also kind of see the fluctuation, the differences in the population status between these houses. So if you look at house number 5, you notice that there's it has a high level of variance between the number of individuals that were there. It looks like it could potentially be a seasonal difference. As we collect more data, we'll be able to get a better picture of that. And then, like I said earlier, when you look at the house number 8, that's a very stable, flat line of number of individuals. So you can kind of see that house, the number of bats using that house fluctuates very little, especially compared to house number 5 or 4. So also you can kind of see a couple of areas where it looks like the numbers drop down to 0. Those are just nights that cold events occur. So I said that bats don't really come out on cold nights. I think I can't remember the exact temperature below which they tend to not leave their roost, but that just kind of exhibits those nights where bat activity was 0. They stayed in their house because it was too cold for them to get out and fly around. And so then looking at activity levels, I just have a comparison between a male and a female. Again, these are just individuals, so not every male has the same sort of pattern we see, but if you look at the numbers highlighted in green, you see that there is a big difference, about 9 days that the bat is unaccounted for between March 17th and March 26th. Looking at the temperature data for that data range, there was only one night in there that the temperature dropped below. So there's 7 or 8 nights there that the bat was not accounted for. That doesn't mean it just dropped off the face of the earth or was hanging out in there. It just means the bat was using a roost that we don't have a pit tag reader on or that we don't currently know about. And then if you look at the numbers highlighted in yellow, this bat visited 3 different roosts in one night. So, it shows that this male particularly, he may be looking for a female, he may be looking for a new roost. His activity pattern is very different than this female, who was very loyal to her roost. She stayed in bat house number 12 for a very long time, and then pretty much without preamble moved to house number 11 in one night. So there's no, we don't know why she did it, but she was very loyal for a while, moved houses, and then was very loyal again. And that is, again, it's not statistically analyzed yet, but it does seem that the females tend to have more of a stable, they pick one place and they stick with it. The males tend to move around. Again, probably part of that reproductive strategy. And then just looking at roost switching, that actually helps us make determinations for the project we're going to talk about next, but just looking at the number of females versus males. So between September 2015 and May, when this data was organized, there were 15 out of 79 females switched houses at least one time, and 11 of 36 males switched houses at least one time. So the percentage, the proportion is about 20% of females and 30% of males. And of those 26 individuals that were jumping houses, all but about 5 of those visited house number 4 at one point. So, house number 4, that could point to the fact that house number 4 is a very common house. It could be just a jump-off point for something else. So what researchers at University of Florida have done, they use this pit tag data, and they can determine which individuals are best suited for either a radio transmitter or a GPS tag. Not every bat that's captured gets one of these. There's certain weight restrictions that have to be put into place. Females that are reproductively active, they don't get radio transmitters or GPS tags. So radio transmitters are placed on individuals that have less roost fidelity. So a lot of those males are going to get these radio transmitters. And basically what we hope by doing this, we put these radio transmitters on a bat that we know is going to be jumping around. You can go out there the next day and try to find where that bat's located. So they're more likely to lead you to a new roost location based on the fact that they jump around a lot. Whereas these GPS collars, they're to get the data from a GPS collar, you actually have to recollar the bat, collect the GPS collar, and download it. So you don't want to put those on a bat that is not going to be located at the same place that is going to be there. So these GPS collars are used mainly to assess foraging patterns. So you find out where these bats are going every night, how much time they're spending there. And I think, again, this is a project that I'm just relaying information from, but I think it collects data every 3, 5, or 10 minutes. It's variable. I don't remember what frequency they have on there, but basically it turns on about sunset. It collects data all night long. It turns off at sunrise, and then I think the battery power lasts for a week or 2, 10 days or something. So 10 days later, we go back, collect the bats, take these collars off, and then are able to find out where they went and ate that night. And so that pretty much ends my talk. I will be happy to entertain any questions if we have the time for it. Thank you. So the question was, we capture 3 to 4 times a year, and how the bats adapt to that. So far, it seems they are not terribly affected by that. The capture started in 2014, And they did monitor very closely, especially since it's an endangered species. They have to get permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and work closely with the regulatory agencies. But since then, we haven't noticed any changes. Since we can monitor the movement of the individuals, they either these roosts are very like a limiting resource and they really don't want to leave it, or they handle the capture very well. We've noticed no difference in them like leaving the roost and completely abandoning it after a capture event. We have noticed that some of the bats, they hear the preparation, like the hammering of the stakes and stuff, and the rustle of the nets, and they I think figured out that they know we're there, and so they don't leave the roost. And so we have a pretty limited window. You can only capture for so many hours after you set them up to make sure that the bats aren't kept in overnight. So we found that they hang out in the roost. Once we start taking the nets down, then they exit and know that they're free for the night. But it's kind of a learned behavior, but I think they're not terribly, it's probably unpleasant, but it's not something that they abandon their roost for.
Hi. Question for you is, what was the distance between the various bat houses that you put up, linear distance, and then were they all placed over the water or next to the water, or how did you determine where to place them?
So the question, or I guess you guys heard the question. The linear distance, that 18 kilometers was the greatest distance between house 12 and number 8. The rest of them tend to be much closer. I can try and go back to that picture real quick. You notice they are clustered, 4, 11, and 12, 10, 9, and 5. And then between 10 and house number 5 and house number 12, that's, I think, 4 to 8 kilometers. It's not a very great distance. So there's a lot of movement between those houses. The placement of the houses, I don't remember. That was actually before my time with the project. I think they just kind of went out and chose places they thought would be suitable for bats to live there. There were acoustic surveys that were done all across Babcock Webb before they built the houses, so they knew bats were present, and then they may have used that to make that decision. Thank you.